Hello, I am Françoise Nicoloff, a French-Australian clinical psychologist for over 40 years now, and your host for the Conscious Ear podcast. Hi, I'm Françoise Nicoloff, your host of the Conscious Ear podcast, and I'm so happy and honored to have Dr. Valerio Vittone today as our guest speaker. And Valerio is going to have you to see things in a different point of view with a level of research which is coming out quite strongly in the last few years, but especially maybe in the last 10, 15 years. We are going to talk about epigenetics. And this is very, very exciting because through that new ways of looking at things, we start to understand a bit more. And before, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Valerio Vittone. He's an Australian biochemist, molecular biologist. You're going to see this guy is amazing. His interest is in molecular medicine, epigenetics, and nutrigenomics. So Dr. Vittone has a PhD in medicine in molecular virology from the University of Sydney in Australia. And he has undertaken groundbreaking studies investigating neurotropic viruses that produced the first comprehensive molecular map of the structural components present in the tegument of the herpes simplex virus type 1. But he's also held key research roles in Australia, where he made innovative discoveries employing a unique PCR cloning technique that he designed to create a comprehensive library of clones that were used to study protein-protein interactions in eukaryotic cells using a yeast hybrid system approach. So you see, Valerio, is quite a thorough researcher and passionate about researcher, but he's also spent a substantial amount of his research analyzing DNA sequences via bioinformatics tools. And the technological advancements in this area, combined with next generation sequencing, called also NGS, and RNA metatranscriptome technologies have changed and his path, and now he focuses on personalized DNA research for patients and treating them with an epigenetics and nutrigenomics approach and personalized DNA-based diets, supplements, and lifestyle advice. So this is this new orientation for Valerio to get interested in the epigenetics and how epigenetics can, if we focus on the genes, how we can change and through lifestyle, diet, nutrients, etc., to change the way that the children with autism or ADHD or depression or anxiety or schizophrenia can be helped as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Valerio Vittone, to be with us today. It's going to be an interesting interview with you, and I'm so happy to have you on board. So first, would you be able to explain to our listeners what is epigenetics?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I was listening to you, and yeah, it's an amazing time regarding this science because epigenetics, as the word implies, so epi in Greek means outside of, and genetics, genes. So the word epigenetics simply means outside of genes. What does this mean? That, as we all know, we have a genetic blueprint, all of us. So our genes, our DNA cannot be changed per se. But having said that, we discovered, especially in the last decade, that outside factors independent of the DNA can actually switch genes on or off. So although the genes cannot be changed, epigenetic switches, if you like, they can switch a gene on or off. And this a profound implication in science, because these epigenetic factors, they come from outside. So they can be environmental factors, they can be dietary factors, they can be even habits that we have that can influence the expressions or how genes are switched on or off in our bodies. For instance, people that they say they got a very stressful life, they produce a lot of cortisol, and this cortisol is as we know in biochemistry, is a hormone that has epigenetic effects on different genes. And this is just an example. But in simple terms, epigenetic looks at how genes can be switched on or off by events that they are outside of the DNA. That can be the environment, that can be our diet, that can be pollution, there can be inflammatory states like caused, let's say, by histamine or allergies, and so on. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's paramount to define, to have a map of all these type of genetic switches, so that we can appreciate how we can change the behavior of our genetic variations that they are unique to us. So a gene can be not working perfectly for a person, but if we understand how we can make it better by activating this gene better by external factors, we can actually create a positive outcome to our health problems.
And so how can we determine that? How can we determine the fact that some factors like environmental factors are going to have an issue on the switch on or switch off of some mechanism of our genes?
Well, one of the key and I'll make examples here. One of the key advancements in science in the last decade, what we call genome-wide associated studies. These particular studies, they involve thousands of different patients, let's say in this case, people with autism spectrum disorders. And then we correlate their genetics to some environmental factors that they have a negative effect for them. As an instance, recently Harvard Medical School correlated the amount of pollution on busy highway and freeway to the degree of severity of autistic spectrum disorder.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing, but thousands of patients. And then from that observation, we can correlate all the genes that they are connected to pollution and the epigenetic changes that pollution has on those genes. They're also connected to autism and other associated disorders. So it's a complete game changer. So when you can do genetic experiments in which you can analyze thousands of patients at the same time and then correlate that particular factor, let's say pollution, to their genetic variances, then you can implement positive changes to the individuals. So for those very specific genetic mutations that they carry that can have an adverse effect with autism.
Uh-huh.
So that's one of the major elements. We also can now correlate multiple disorders that they are connected to autism at genetic level. And this is another fascinating advancement because often autistic kids and adults, they share a comorbidity, meaning they have other associated problems. And I'll just give you an idea of this, that 30 to 61% of autistic kids also have ADHD. 11 to 40% have a series of anxiety disorders, and 7% results in depression or severe depression. Over 50% have chronic sleep problems. And in terms of diet, 32% of kids aged between 2 and 5, they are overweight, and 1 in 5, they're obese. So there is that correlation, let's say, with insulin-resistant diabetes, prenatal diabetes from their mom. And all those genes are correlated to autism, and they are all correlated to this type of disorders like the adhd. And they share common genes that we can evaluate, and then by looking at the individual genes that they share a commonality, we can implement the dietary or lifestyle changes to making those genes functioning better, so that we can mitigate autism spectrum disorders in a much more profound way than we could do in the past. Let's say autistic kids, for instance, when we see genes that they are correlated to be overweight, or if they have diabetes genes, we can actually implement dietary intervention that involves, let's say, a more ketogenic type of diet that also works very well with the people with schizophrenia or ADHD, that makes them better and can make a profound difference in their lives and so on. And this is just an example.
But you mentioned also that in some previous discussion that we had, that, for instance, the elements of the genes is also working on the neurotransmitters.
Yes. And to this point, there is a fascinating study that has been recently published in 2017 in the International Journal of Molecular Science, that has investigated thousands of genes that they were shared by autistic kids, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD, anxiety, and so on. And this major study has found that there are 23 susceptibility genes that they are primarily shared amongst all these disorders. So they are shared with ASD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD, and so forth. But the 5-6 major ones of these genes, they involve how these neurotransmitters are regulating in the brain. And I'll give you some instances that they are quite important. Most of the autistic kids or individual, they have what we call dopamine dysregulation, meaning their dopamine levels and the way dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine, works in the brain is not working well, either from a production of dopamine point of view or in the way a dopamine interacts with these dopamine receptors in the brain. So what it came from this... Can
you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I'll explain a bit more. If you think of dopamine as a key and a receptor as a door, if there are not enough key to open these multiple doors, then communication is not working very well. So the brain of kids with ASD has sometimes less keys, or the door is not opening well, so that the dopamine neurotransmitter is not functioning well with them in relation to their receptor. So the dopamine binds to a receptor, and that's why I made the analogy with the door and the key, because if you think of something, a key that can open a door, the key is the dopamine and the door is the receptor. So when the key gets into the door, then you can open the lock and create an effect. So here with autistic kid, it was found that the door lock, it's faulty. There are problems with the door lock. And by looking at the door lock, different type of locks. So by looking at these different type of dopamine receptor mutations, we can now say, we can now make better treatment for the kids connected to their dopamine levels. And I'll give you an example here because this is relevant to you, Françoise.
Yeah, we do work a lot with autistic children. Yeah,
that's right. So one of the things that you applied for over two decades at the Tomaic Institute is the use of sound and music to alleviate autistic the autistic conditions, right?
Yes.
And it turns out that, and I know you play Mozart and all these amazing classical music, and it turns out that music like Mozart or Beethoven increases the amount of dopamine in the brain and alleviates these mutations, if you like, of the dopamine receptor. So, in other words, when you're playing music, you are creating, if you like, an epigenetic change that alleviates a DNA malfunction with the music.
Yes.
Likewise, we can improve dopamine levels by intervening on other factors. As an instance, we can, by introducing exercise, certain type of exercise in autistic children, but also in ADHD kids, we can increase the efficiency of their dopamine level. We can optimize their dopamine levels, their serotonin levels, and other genes that they are alleviating this faulty receptor occurrence, if you like, indirectly. So although they have a genetic anomaly, if you like, with the example of this dopamine receptor, we can create interventions that they can alleviate the symptoms with epigenetic changes. And so in a way, music is an epigenetic factor as noise. So if you say, that's why often you say, okay, kids with autism, they are really annoyed by noise. They become hyperactive. They can be quite bad. And that's a negative epigenetic factor. So noise or noise pollution, especially when you expose kids to noise in cities like Sydney or Melbourne, have a really detrimental effect on their situation sometimes. And on the other hand, music, which is a positive epigenetic change, can provide more dopamine to their brains and can optimize that sort of what we call dopamine homeostasis, meaning the good balance of dopamine, especially with ASD kids. There is a reduced dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, it was found. And this is just one gene that was found amongst those 23 susceptibility genes that I was talking before. Another major one that has been found to be affecting people with autism, but also people with bipolar disorder and ADHD, is the serotonin receptor. Again, to explain it, serotonin is a major neurotransmitter that controls a lot of regulatory processes in the brain, and is vital for a autistic kid in the sense that it was observed that serotonin dysregulation, meaning either too much serotonin or too little serotonin, can create some really bad issues with autistic kids.
At what level, Vittorio?
Serotonin. One of the things that serotonin does is able to crosstalk to other neurotransmitters, if you like, and especially it cross-talks to the GABA neurotransmitter, and indirectly it modulates GABA and glutamate levels in the brain. And why is it so important for autistic kids is because, especially from a sociological and interaction point of view in their daily life, glutamate is a high level of glutamates that have been found in autistic kids, creates that effect of being extremely anxious and hyperactive and giving them all these very glutamate is the neurotransmitters that it's capable of exciting you. So all these excitatory events like that autistic kids has, and let's say they are very sensitive to light, they are very sensitive to touch, and they really have, really bad overreactions for this. They are a consequence of high glutamate levels, and we've seen the same pattern of behavior also in ADHD kids, that they also have high glutamate levels. And what does make glutamate levels more stable and lowers them down? Well, good serotonin level, good GABA levels. And the important take-home message, not to get too overcomplicated with the biochemistry of this, is that serotonin, GABA, glutamate, dopamine, they're all neurotransmitters that they talk to each other and they can influence each other. And if they are not in a balance, then problems occur. And in some extreme cases, as bipolar disorder or autism or ADHD, they result in negative effects. And when it comes, we were talking about serotonin dysregulation and the receptor that was found faulty in ADHD kids and also in bipolar patients and so forth. One really interesting thing that I want to say during this podcast for the parents of autistic kids that has been found, that we've just spoken about before, is the vital role of vitamin D that is emerging to treat autistic kids. And I explained this. It was found that high doses of vitamin D in different trials have improved the core symptom of autism in about 75% of autistic children that participated to these studies, which is huge. And the reason for this is that vitamin D that you get when you're exposed to the sun modulates serotonin levels. So vitamin D, it's not just a vitamin. It's an epigenetic signal, if you like, that modulates serotonin levels of individuals in general, but it has a great effect with autistic kids because especially those one that they got that serotonin receptor that is faulty. If you get treatment with vitamin D, you get great outcomes. And I won't get into this. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's amazing, but nowadays we protect our kids with so much hats and and jackets and to go to the water or to be in the sun. And especially we should not have our children in the sun. In fact, we are creating a generation of children who do not absorb enough vitamin D, so they are vitamin D deficient.
Exactly.
Which is a bit of a, we are in Australia here, so we are the country of sun.
Yeah, and I want to say something with regards to this, which is quite interesting. That I won't disclose the name of the company, but one of the major company in making supplements here in Australia. I was talking to one of their executives a few days ago, and we were talking about that there is so much vitamin D supplementation in the pharmacies in Australia because people although we live in Australia, so a very sunny country, right? But people in Sydney or Melbourne, they lack vitamin D because they don't have enough exposure to the sun rays due to their jobs or due to the sort of lifestyle, especially in winter times. So there is a huge effort to supplement, if you want, with supplements in gel capsules, this vitamin D that we no longer take in cities like Sydney and Melbourne because of our, very active lifestyle. So we are in an office stuck for 10, 12 hours a day with the fluoro light or like the neon light, and we don't get enough vitamin D, although the sun is out of the door.
Yeah, and so what's happening with those kids that we protect with, cream, sunscreen cream, and we don't get them to have to have their body naked in the sun like we used to have when we were growing up. So what's happening to those kids? What should we do and advise the parents with?
Well, that's a very good question. So, and this is, I think, a lot of the things, again, is starting to emerge from science now. That's why there is such an exciting time for vitamin D at the moment, because it's being correlated to so many problems with adults and kids, including depression, diabetes, insulin resistance, and so forth, and autism, of course. But so what is the right, to your point, what is the right intervention? Because parents will say, well, wait a second, we are trying desperately to protect them from the sun, not to develop cancer and melanoma. And at the same time, we need vitamin D to actually make them function correctly. So it looks like a contradiction. And to solve this contradiction from a scientific point of view, I say, is use common sense, in the sense that I say to a lot of my patients, I says, don't go to the beach with your kids and have them exposed to the sun for like 2-3 hours in a row. That's where the damage occurs, that, extensive exposure to sun rays, especially in the summer times, in which they just go to the beach sometimes and they never go back home. I mean, it's great because you have fun at the beach, but here, when we are talking about sun exposure, we are talking about moderate sun exposure. And I'll be more specific. So what I mean by moderate sun exposure, that if you expose your children, let's say, to that 20 to 35 minutes of sun every day, you are likely to get enough vitamin D to cover the gap. But if you don't, then they might be deficient. And that's where intervention with my vitamin D occurs. Also, there is this point to make that because obviously we cannot keep kids with autism, for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours in the sun every day, if they require additional vitamin D because, let's say, they have a severe mutation in a specific serotonin gene, then we might intervene with supplements in higher doses. And sorry.
So with what you've mentioned before, Valerio, about the expression of the mutation of the genes, would you say that the severity of the difficulties or the deficit, like with DSM-5, we categorize the autistic children in 3 levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, and the level 3 being the worst conditions. Would you say that's because those neurotransmitters associated with the mutation of those genes are severely in deficit?
Yes. So the other thing that science have done in these studies, they correlated the severity. That's a good question. You just asked that. I was about to tell you anyway, but you mentioned it. They said that these studies that they've done, with the genes that we are talking about, the investigation have correlated the severity of the autistic disorder with the severity of the mutation that occurred in those specific genes. So, and that's the beauty, that you can actually correlate the severity with the disorder with the severity of the genetic mutation that is occurring in these specific genes. And another thing that I found fascinating that is emerging now, a huge topic we haven't even started to touch as yet, is the microbiome. That there are studies who have been correlated, they say the severity of microbiome, if you want, dysregulation. So it's been found that autistic kid has a very different microbiome than a normal person, in the sense that they have a much greater amount of bad bacteria, that they are producing these molecules, that they are creating all sorts of things such as inflammation and influencing the neurotransmitter in themselves. And they've been correlating the amount of bacteria also with the severity of the autistic disorder.
Wow, so, that's very impressive as well. Yeah.
That's very. So to give you just an example of this is that individuals like with ASD, with autistic spectrum disorder, they got high level of Clostridia bacteria, which is a negative bacteria infecting the intestine. They also have higher severity in their autistic condition.
Mm.
The other thing that has been found with the microbiome, which is also fascinating, is that when we actually introduce more positive bacteria, so the good bacteria, to autistic kids, they have a much greater lifestyle, and their autistic condition gets better. So the severity of the symptom decreases when you are introducing, let's say, bacteria like bifidobacteria. And the reason for this is that another things that we have started to understand from the microbiome, that a lot of these good bacteria in the microbiome, guess what? They are neurotransmitter factories. So a lot of these bacteria, they are making serotonin, they are making GABA, they are making all the neurotransmitters in the gut. Then the body is able to utilize, especially with the communication that happens through the gut and the brain through the vagus nerve.
Yeah, and that's where we work on also with the Tomatis method, is to help the vagus nerve to be more effective.
Correct. And especially with your methodology, you're looking at the limbic part of the brain, which is affected by the sound. And I guess the beauty of all this that is emerging, that we are able now to connect the dots with the microbiome, with the neurotransmitters, with the epigenetic changes that are occurring and we can influence at the mother level and before even the child is born, but also during the lifetime, postnatally. So during the initial stage of our lives in autistic kids, we can influence with these positive lifestyle and environmental changes that we can provide to them, so that they can alleviate the autistic conditions by switching genes on and off that they are faulty from day one. And all these elements are coming together. So the microbiome is interacting with the neurotransmitters, interacting with the immune system, and is interacting with these epigenetic switches that all together they create these complex effects on autistic kids, and with effects on other disorders that they also have most of the times, like ADHD, or if they are overweight, or if they have allergies, let's say, to dyes. Histamines is another major element that influences the serotonin, the neurotransmitters, because it has an effect on the degradation of this neurotransmitter, as well as constant brain inflammation with histamine, high histamine kids. That's why it's such a major element in autistic kids and ADHD kids, to trying to minimize histamines in the brain and in their guts.
And I guess that's the reason why we see more and more the combination of those multidisciplinary approaches, but definitely involving the gut-brain health.
Correct. What we call the gut-brain axis. So there's interplay of forces that are communicating back and forth from the gut to the brain, back to the gut. And the mediator, if you want, of that communication is the immune system. So, bacteria are able to elicit immune responses. And in simple terms, they trigger the immune system to secrete chemicals that we call cytokines, that they are switching on the immunity. So they are switching on inflammatory responses. And that's why it's so important to preserve that microbiome balance by dietary interventions. Let's say in our program, we look at prebiotic fibers, probiotics, that they are specifically targeting certain type of genetics, and also increasing exercise levels that they can improve the microbiome, and also giving proper nutritional changes that they improve the microbiome of autistic kids. One classic example is this sort of what we call a keto-style Mediterranean, low gluten and low dairy diet that autistic kids, they greatly benefit, as well as ADHD kids, because it solves all that histamine and inflammatory problem that is occurring in the gut, that is also influencing the brain, and is mediated by the immune system. So it's, as you say, these by adopting a more holistic approach, by looking at the genetics combined with interventions like the sound, like you've been doing at the Tamaic for so long, or dietary intervention, lifestyle changes, and so on, we can really make a big difference in autistic kids to alleviate their symptoms.
And one question, Valerio, that I would have, but I'm sure also parents will ask, is how can we test the genes? In fact, how can we know that our children will have a deficiency in such and such genes? And what are the protocols that we can use to alleviate those switching off or switching too much, or hyperactivity of those genes?
Yeah, that's probably the question that I'm more concerned with what we do. So it's a very simple, this day is a very simple thing to do, if you like, with the advent of commercial DNA testing. So about 10 years ago, to have a genetic report with a sort of number of genes that we are testing now with our DNA testing, with our protocol, it will cost you $500,000. Let's say. It will be, I'm not even joking. I remember when I did my PhD, when I was researching in the lab, and to test, let's say, a few genes, it will cost you thousands and thousands of dollars. Now we can test, thousands of genes in 2-3 days for $100, or let's say less than $1,000, depending on the complexity of the genetic report that they are doing. So the costs due to the technological advancement in this field, have decreased dramatically.
And so who does those tests?
So it's very simple. So now we can provide a very simple kit. So it's like a test tube in which the child can simply virtually spit their saliva in a test tube. It takes about 10 minutes. Then there is a liquid in this test tube that you mix that preserves the DNA. And then we are able to send the DNA of the child contained in the saliva sample in Germany, in which a complex test is done, and which tests thousands of different genes connected to this, connected to their diets, connected to all those switches that we are talking about, and then having a profiling on multiple levels from their microbiome. All those dopamine, all the neurotransmitters genes that are involved in autism, that they can be switched either that they create too much dopamine or too little dopamine, or too much serotonin or too little serotonin. We can also check all the enzymes that they are controlling dopamine, serotonin, tryptophan, that they are breaking down these neurotransmitters. So we can have a much clearer understanding of the individual blueprint of the child. And at that moment, when the report comes back, we can actually have some idea of how these neurotransmitters and how these receptors at genetic level, they might function or not. And then implement the dietary changes, the lifestyle changes that we are talking about. So it's very simple. You do the testing, then we analyze all these different genes that they are influencing the neurotransmitters, their microbiome, their susceptibility, let's say, to have a mitochondria. That's another thing we haven't explored yet in our discussion, but perhaps we'll do it next.
We'll do it in the next one, I guess.
Or in the next talk. There is, they often have these. Subcellular organelle, which is a factor. It's called the mitochondria, that is responsible to produce the energy in the brain that is used by everybody for your normal brain function. And if this mitochondria doesn't work very well, again, mitochondrial dysfunction has been associated strongly with autism, diabetes type 2, depression, and so many other causes that, again, they are complex and interconnected that we can test. But when you get the genetic report, you don't have to be a genetic specialist, because then there will be a person like me that will tell you in simple lay term, analyzing the report, what sort of dietary or lifestyle change you might want to adopt with your kid that is suffering from adhd or autistic problems. So what age can we do such a test? Can we do very early on babies or toddlers? Do you know if they have the susceptibility? Because how would you explain that the characteristics of autism and sensory processing disorder are often starting to express themselves between 18 months and 24 months? Yes. That's the thing. That's the thing we haven't discussed quite thoroughly before. And thank you for the question, because it's very relevant. To give you an idea, and you're rightly to say that, what we say in medical terms, that autistic traits, they start at prenatal, and postnatal, which means prenatally, it involves the mother's behavior before the baby is born. So if a mother has a lifestyle that, let's say, consumption of alcohol, very stressful lives, is exposed to pollution, is exposed to noise, and the mother herself has specific genetic mutations before the baby is conceived, it starts there. And because this genetic mutation and these epigenetic changes that the mother does bring about before the baby is born, meaning how the mother switches on the genes, is likely then to be inherited by the child, which is another fascinating thing that has been recently discovered, that how the mother switches the gene on and off, that sort of setup is being taken by the fetus during the gestation period, during the pregnancy. So so the habits of the mother, in the way she does switches her genes on and off, depending on the habit, they're passed on to the kid, the child. And then we go to the next definition when we say perinatally means, and that term means during pregnancy up to 1 year old after pregnancy. So perinatal by definition is the changes that they are connected during pregnancy, in the 9 months of pregnancy, plus the first 12 months of life for the child. Those are perinatal changes, we say. Yeah. And then, so all those changes that the mother has already made before falling pregnant, then they are translated to the child. And then the child starts to interact with its environment in the first 12 months, making additional changes that they are contributing to his or her ASD disorder. And then, of course, after the first year, we say postnatally, so between 1 to 5 years of age, especially between 2 and 5, you can start really to see these symptoms getting worse and getting more obvious, if you like. And yes, to your question, we can, how early we can test for the genetics? Well, some of the genes can be tested even during the pregnancy. So I always suggest we can't do it. That's a government test, but I often say you should have a general DNA test during your pregnancies to see for major genetic problems that you may incur during your pregnancy. Often there are a lot of women now that they test themselves before pregnancy with the same test. So from their mother genetic variants, we can already make really good assumptions on how the risk of autism will be in the child. A typical example of this is a gene that we call MTHFR, which is a lot of now moms, they know about this. They test themselves, which is the gene that regulates folate levels, the folate levels in an individual. More specifically, this particular gene controls the transformation of the dietary folates that we get from the diet into the active form of folate, which we call tetrahydrofolate or metafolate. And if the gene is faulty, it creates an apocalypse in the body, because this particular form of folate, which we call 5-tetrahydrofolate, controls millions of different things, from production of neurotransmitters, from DNA replication. I can't even start. We can dedicate one just discussion on MATHFR. But what has been found that these particular females with autistic children are more likely to have the mutation for this MATHFR gene. It's a very important marker that females can test themselves even before they have a pregnancy or during the pregnancy, so that they know if they got a severe mutation, let's say MATHFR, they are likely to have some problems, not just in the fetus development, but postnatally after the baby is born, it could also have autistic problems.
Oh,
and
so that would be a great susceptibility information to have this information about susceptible possible case of autism.
That's right. That's right. MATHFR is one of those main genes that I didn't mention before. You remember when we were talking about the 23 susceptibility genes in common with bipolar? This is one of them. MATHFR is one of them. And it's definitely a key gene. It's probably the most investigated gene in epigenetics. Is the rock star of epigenetics because there are so many things that MATHFR indirectly or directly influences in the body, from neurological and health to inflammation to depression, anxiety, and the list goes on, and autism.
Okay, we'll need to have an interview, a podcast on just the MATHFR. It seems to be quite amazing. And if we can also prevent or let the young parents to know that there might be some things that they need to change in their lifestyle before they conceive because of the susceptibility of the MTHFR. That could be quite a good way to do as well.
100%. And this is a key. But that's why, if you notice, even now a GP, you see a lot of GP in Australia, they're starting to become, to start to specialize in assessing MATHFR mutations because it has such profound implication. The folate cycles, the MATHFR, is a key enzyme in this pathway that controls so many different things that is vital for the well-being of the baby postnatally. But MATHFR is only one. We can test a lot more than that with the mother and before he actually conceives, but that's definitely one of the major ones that it's important to test. And the other thing that is incredible that now we can test with this amazing new technology that just emerged is the microbiome. One of the things that is being, this is really new science, that now what's emerging is that the mother microbiome is actually being inherited by the child. So if the mother has a bad microbiome at a particular stage while it's conceiving, it's likely to pass on this bad microbiome to the child, and that switches on all these bad epigenetic changes that the baby inherits through this microbiome imbalance, to keep it really extremely simplistic.
So we'll certainly do a podcast as well on the microbiome because this is so important in our lifestyle, but in the way that we can help to reduce some aspects of any mental disease or disorders that we can name at any stage, in which are coming more and more numerous around us as professionals working with children and adults who have issues at level of communication, socialization, or learning, and just fitting into the society. So definitely there will be more communication with you. But so if, Valerio, where can it, so you are based in Sydney and Queensland, is that right?
Yeah, so what we do, we are based in Sydney and in Brisbane on the Gold Coast, but we are operating on the eastern seaboard, but and probably soon in Melbourne if the pandemic allows. But what is great about our system is that it's completely remote. So you can do it. We can send you the genetic test directly at home. You can do it very quickly on yourself or on your children, very early, even if they are 2 or 3 years of age, provided that you can collect that saliva sample, and then we can analyze and have the consultations online on Zoom, like you're doing a normal Zoom meetings and consultations. So you can be located wherever you like, and if I'm able to view your child, and you can explain their symptoms, and then we run the DNA test. We can do everything, not even leaving your home.
Yeah, that's great. So it's definitely available in Australia.
Yeah, and I have patients even offshore in Italy or the US, because again, in this global world, the test is done in Germany. We're one of the best genetic companies in the world. And the test itself can take 4 or 5 weeks. But the beauty of this methodology is that what we do have an intervention in 2 different stages. So what we initially do, we have a consultation with the parents, the mother and the child, so that we can assess their family history and their symptoms. And that's a crucial stage, because by analyzing what the kids have, we can already make inferences, guesses about how the genes have mutated. And we can, let's say, a lot of the time I hear from others, like, my child has got really bad symptoms when he's eating certain type of foods, or he's eating gluten, or he doesn't sleep very well at night, or he's really bad with noise. So we go through all the family history of the child and their parents, so that we also see where they are coming from. And then from that initial report, we can already make a lot of interventions in terms of diet and initial supplements that we give them straight away. So we have this initial report even before the DNA testing is done. That starts them to do, they can start to do real significant changes in their lives in the next 5 to 6 weeks. And a lot of the changes that they make within the program, they create really good results even before they receive their DNA test back, which is great. And then after 4 or 5 weeks, when we really get the very specific DNA mutations that we were talking about, let's say if they got a dopamine receptor or a serotonin receptor that is not genetically right, then we can really fine-tune what we call precision medicine, those interventions in terms of supplementation or in terms of helping the microbiome with very specific strain of probiotics. They are very specific to them, that they can help them to, let's say, decrease their histamines in their gut and brain, and increase their serotonin and GABA balance, depending on the specific genetic mutations that they have, genetic variances, we say. So stage 1, consultation, having this started report that they can have within 2-3 days, and then they start with the interventions for, let's say, a month to a month and a half, and then we get the gene testing back, and then we look at it, we deep dive into further changes, and we fine tune the changes in the 3 to 6 months period for the long-term positive effects of the program.
So Valerio, if people want to connect with you, how can they connect with you through your website, or is that what's your website?
Yeah, so they can connect with me making an appointment through drvaleriovitone.com or through my email, which is also on the website, I believe, which is Valerio at drvaleriovitone.com. Which I'm not sure, but perhaps would you be able to provide with the podcast?
Yeah, well, of course, we will also put in the notes under the podcast. We'll put your name and the website as well, where people can connect with you, and we'll certainly send the podcast as well. Yeah,
that's right. So through the website, through the email, and we are very prompt. We got this very good, sort of customer service way that as soon as we receive the email, I can read them, and we can make an initial consultation in which it lasts for an hour, that we can evaluate all the symptoms, as I said, and we can produce the first starter report before the genetic testing even occurs. And as I said, a lot of the parents that I've been seeing with ADHD or autistic symptoms, they get really good results even before the genes are coming. And it's so fascinating because from their symptoms, now with sort of my expertise and experience, you can pretty much get very close to their genetic, even before you get the DNA as a confirmation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But of course, yeah.
I guess when you know exactly what does what, it's easy to much easier to be able to do a diagnosis or to do an inference, or
That's right.
Exactly.
But what I want to just finish saying is that what is the important the difference between having a genetic test done by, let's say, analyzed by an expert like myself versus those generic tests that you can buy online like 23andMe, is that by being generic, they are not, sometimes the correlation may not be accurate. So you really need to have someone like a scientist or genetic experts to look at the data and then give you the right recommendations. Because if you rely on this algorithm that they have on this commercial DNA testing, sometimes they can be inaccurate. And that's what is important here, to have both the testing together with the expertise.
Absolutely, Valerio. You are totally right with mentioning that. I guess, it's the same thing as going to fast food and going to a restaurant.
Yeah, that's right.
You get what you get.
Yeah, you get what you pay. But it's not even what you pay for, because it's really just about finding better choices. And especially now, you'll see a lot of commercialization of DNA testing, but you have to have the right protocol and the right expertise to really get the information right, and to give the right recommendations on the genetics.
Absolutely.
And by all means, any of the patients from the Tomaic Institute, they got a special place in my evaluation when they're going to come along. I'll definitely.
Okay, so for the listeners, if you refer to the podcast, the Conscious Ear podcast, or if you refer to coming from the Tomatis group, then you have a special attention from Dr. Valerio.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, it will be great, because we could also, in a more serious way, we can actually integrate the existing sound therapy that you do with our system, and it's a win-win, because
absolutely. And I absolutely see the how that could the contribution and the collaboration could work for our young clients, but also for the adults as well.
Yeah.
So, Valerio, I really, really want to thank you for your time. I know you are very busy, and it's been an invaluable sets of information that you've given us. Being at cutting edge, really at the top, latest discoveries that we can talk about to help those people and children especially who have issues with autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, and the rest of it. We'll certainly do other interviews with you as well, because you have so much to share with us and valuable information. So I think we are going to make some regular interviews with you, Valerio. But at the same time, I really, really want to thank you for your time today. And again, for the listeners, if you want to get in contact with Dr. Valerio Vittone, you can connect with his website, www.Valerio, V for Victor, ITTONE.com website, and you'll have the website name under this podcast as well.
Yeah, so, and if you if you go on Google, if you just Google my name, Dr. Valerio Vittone, we'll all come up top on the Google ranking and the science and the research that I've done in the past. So very easy.
Thank you so much to our guest speaker today. And this is once again Françoise Nicoloff, your guide to wellness and better life. Talk to you soon.